If you're a B2B business, a B2B tech company, or a B2B marketer, you're in the right place. Coming to you from Studio 26, this is the Interesting B2B Marketers Podcast, bringing you interesting contemporary takes, industry tips, guest interviews, and true stories from B2B marketers in the trenches. Now, here's your host, Steve Goldhaber.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Studio 26. I'm the host of this podcast, Interesting B2B Marketers, and I'm excited to have Christian join us on the show today. Welcome.
Hi, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right. So before we jump into case studies, go ahead and give us a little 60-second background about who you are.
Okay, well, here we go. I'm originally from Austria in Central Europe. Spent most of my life out in Asia, specifically the Philippines, Singapore. I spent the last 13 years of my life out in Shanghai, China, where I met my wonderful wife, who is originally from Toronto, Canada. Just following me around the map so far. And I am currently based here in this great city of Toronto with my wife and daughter. And I am also the co-founder and director of client engagement here at EINBLICK Consulting. So we are a consulting firm that specializes in branding and marketing for B2B tech and professional services firms. And I am also the host of the B2B Marketers on a Mission podcast.
Yeah, awesome. Cool. All right, let's jump into the case. The first one you're going to walk us through has to do with a joint venture between two different companies. This is in the auto industry. And the need here is they needed to figure out some.
Absolutely. So I always like to call this one like the mixed marriage, right? So it's like two different cultures coming together. And it really was true in every sense of the word, right? There were these two big conglomerates. They had very different ways of running their businesses. And this happened to be in the automotive spare parts industry, which I can attest to is a very, for lack of a better description, an intensely competitive space, because you're dealing with the bigger brands who are fighting with product expertise, know-how, product itself, and then you're dealing with the local counterparts who, well, they fight with lower prices and a good network, right? So I think the challenge here was manifold because, you had a new company, you had people from both sides, from two different companies and two different corporate cultures now becoming one team who had to work together. But you also had a new company, which you can rightfully attest to. There is zero brand awareness in the market. They don't have an actual identity or positioning to speak of. And within a very short time, they had to prove that they were going to be profitable, right? Which is no small feat by any means, right? So where did we come into the picture? We started basically by not designing a brochure first. We got everybody together on their teams, right? The executive team, the mid-level managers, the junior level managers at separate times, of course, right? And we did what we ran a diagnostic canvas, right? So what that basically means is, okay, well, what do you see as the strength of your company? And please do not talk about your product, all right?
Yeah.
What is it that you are trying to solve for your customer? Give us an understanding of this ecosystem that you are working in and how does that help the customer, right? And from doing this exercise, it was interesting to extract from them. Of course, some of them couldn't help themselves and they dropped all the patented products and all that. And we're like, okay, well, we'll get to that in a second, right? But what is it that you guys actually do that helps your customers, right? And from digging and continuously probing, what we actually uncovered was not that the strength was the people. The strength was they had people that used to be on the client side.
Okay.
Right? So they understood what the challenges were when the spare parts come into the production plant, into the assembly line, right? And it all goes back to producing more, reducing downtime, reducing inefficiencies, reducing errors, etc., right? And because they understood that process so well, they were equipped with the know-how and the experience and the solutions, which they then were able to package, and that's what they were able to sell to the customer as a key selling point, right? Whereas everybody else in the competitive ecosystem, which we also happen to look at, they were talking about products, right? We've got the best this, we've got the best that, we've got a patented solution, but come on, nobody cares about that, right? And so we took that and we used that as part of the relevant brand strategy we developed for them. We also then came up with the full brand identity, which was, if I do say so myself, exceptionally different from what the competitors looked like, right? Because it had to be. They had to stand out because they were They were smaller in terms of size compared to their competitors, right? But they were competing in the same space. They were going after the same RFPs, right? RFQs, et cetera, right? So that's how we,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say the positioning is very interesting, and it's funny how just there's a safety net in product, right? Like
Yes.
any executive at the company who just kind of talks about product, it's safe. Sometimes they're completely right. Yes, they have a superior product, or some technical part of how they're manufactured or distributed is better. But is that of interest to someone who doesn't really know and trust you yet? And what I try to advise clients on is there's a time and a place to have that product war, meaning like you will go to combat and you're going to talk about your competitor's product. There's a time and a place. But if you have that conversation too early, people aren't ready for it. They're going to tune you out. How was that struggle to get them to align on that like unique positioning? Was it relatively easy? Did it hit them as like, oh my God, it's been in front of us the whole time, or did you have to really drag them into it?
It was a process where they kind of knew that this was their unique selling point, but they had this, I'm going to call it like relevation. So an elevated revelation, right? They had that relevation when we actually mapped it out for them in a workshop. And then they looked at that and took a step back, and we could see them like looking at each other like, yeah, that's it, right? And, it was interesting to see that unfold because in the beginning, they all had different opinions, right?
Yeah.
They all agreed to a certain extent that it was their understanding of the customer's struggles that unified them. And there was something there. It was like, but I think what was missing there was the factor, and they needed to have that mapped out, diagrammed out in order for them to understand that, right?
All right. So my next question, this is, I'm smiling. So those watching the video will see that I'm smiling, but the audio listeners clearly cannot. So just know that I'm smiling, audio listeners. So now you've got a good positioning. It's the decision that every marketer is faced with. Do you vet the positioning by talking to your customers, or do you just feel good about it and launch? How did you guys proceed?
Yeah, so we did the latter, although we insisted that we needed to test it first. But this was one of these, as it tends to be, this is one of these situations where they said, look, we understand that you have to go through that process and it's the right way to do it, but we're a little bit on a time crunch, and we have to show somebody higher up, the board of directors, the CEO, somebody at Global HQ, that things are moving and that we are putting things out there and we're delivering. So unfortunately, against our advice, they just released that into the wild.
It's the most stressful time to be a marketer and faced with that decision, because everything just points to validate it. Even if you have to do it like the wrong way, meaning like, hey, just grab 10 customers and get their reaction as opposed to like formal focus groups. Every marketer is faced with that decision. That would be maybe we should add a part to the podcast. It's like betting. Everyone can bet on every case study. Did you validate it? And I'd say most times not. Most time there is such a sense of urgency and need or confidence by leadership that we got it right. But obviously that is so dangerous to do, because you can just spend a good 3 to 6 months implementing something and then realize, oh my God, we got it wrong. And now we've got to backtrack.
Absolutely. But I will add in one caveat there, Steve, that we said, okay, if you're the client, at the end of the day, it's your decision. This is what we recommend.
Yeah.
It's entirely up to you, but just know that we feel that this is the right way to do it. So we released that into the wild, but like 6 months later, we did tell them, let's go. Now that you've got some clients, you've got some traction, let's go and test that out and see if what we put out there resonates, right? We eventually did conduct that survey with some customers. And, of course, it's not always such a straightforward process as you can rightfully attest to, because some people just flat out don't care.
Yeah.
Right? If they say it doesn't make any difference to me as long as they deliver a good product, right? So, and that goes back to why we understand, like, yes, we get it that the client wants to focus on the product, because their customers are out there saying, like, we don't care about your positioning. It's all about your product at the end of the day. But we did get some customers that we interviewed where they did really give us great feedback. And they said, well, yes, it resonates with me. However, maybe you might want to consider changing this and this. So they actually did take the time to provide us with that constructive feedback that we were looking for.
All right. Well, that's good.
Yeah.
It was the right decision later in the process, which is good.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. Anything else you want to share about the first case study?
Yes, indeed. I've done a couple of these brand rollouts, and the brand rollouts are only as good as the consistency and the follow-up and the regular, I'm not going to use the word policing, but the regular monitoring, right? And because we've been in situations before where the client insists, no, we just do it once and then that's it, right? And what we usually tend to see happening in the succeeding months is that if the brand is not properly monitored, people will just go ahead and do whatever they want, right? And we wanted to avoid that from happening with this kind of case because of the stakes that were involved. So what we did was on the day that we actually launched the brand, we had a formal workshop at the headquarters where we involved obviously the members of the board, members of the marketing team, but more importantly, the marketing team went around and selected what they call brand champions. So people that are in a non-marketing function that were responsible for enforcing the brand and seeing that the brand is used properly, right? And the way that we did the brand rollout was we did it, or we communicated it as if we were sitting in their own shoes, or we were looking at this from their lens. And what that basically means in layman's terms is, why should somebody in HR or in accounting, right, who's in charge of payroll, care about the brand?
Yeah.
How is it relevant to them? Why should they care, and what's in it for them? So that's how we spun it in this rollout. And what we then did was every 3 or 4 months, we did a regular brand workshop where we told them, okay, so this is the next step of the rollout. And this is what you should be looking out for. And this is why it's relevant to you. And these are the next steps. So everything was mapped out. There was a roadmap. There was an action plan. There was a calendar. And by doing it that way, and by having this regular and frequent communication, everybody was aligned, regardless of whether they were marketing or not, right? Because marketing or the brand team, they were the gatekeepers, right? They were the ones leading the initiative, but everybody else understood that they were a part of this exercise as well.
Yeah. I think that's smart, especially as you get into these really large companies. You realize
Absolutely.
that you can't as marketers or brand marketers just muscle everything through on your own. You've got to provide the inspiration, the toolkit, the training, but recruiting top brand ambassadors is a great strategy.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Let's jump into case study number 2. This one is for a large tech software company, and we're going to talk about playing some games. So the old gamification strategy. Take it away.
Okay, just a very brief background to give people some context. All right, so this client continues to be, a leader in the testing equipment and computer software space. So what they wanted to do was conduct outreach to the target market and potentially drum up some new business by tapping into hot/trending topics within that specific space. So who are they talking to here? Who was it that they were trying to reach out to? Engineers, right? And so whether folks know this or not, but engineers love very technical things. That's short of stating the obvious. But they also love to analyze situations and start dismantling them, right? Because that's what they're trained to do, right? If they're working in a reactor or if they're working in a plant, they are trained to identify problems and solve them, right? So we had the idea of why don't we tap into what we know is that need that they have, that tendency that they have, and instead of just posting content about this topic, which they most likely will, the most likely reaction that you'll get is they'll scroll past it, right? Why don't we gamify this a little bit, right? And spin it from that angle, okay, let's test your knowledge on this topic by coming up with an online quiz, right? So the client had their database of contacts that they wanted to reach out to and what they called their wish list of their 300 or 400 ideal accounts that they wanted to tap into, right? So what we did was we came up with a creative direct mailer and an EDM, and we blasted it out saying hey, there's this little quiz we want you guys to take if you're interested, and if you're one of the first 10 contestants to sign in and participate, these are some of the prizes that you'll get. We also used influencers because, yes, there are engineers out there that have a huge following on social media that write about this stuff, right? And obviously there was a campaign webpage. So what we did then was, so we did all that outreach, right? Where we made it about the target audience and saying like, okay, well, we all know you guys are smart, so let's see how well you do. And it was a really short quiz. There were only 6 questions, right? Because you want to grab their attention, you want them to take action. And if you send out a quiz with 20 or 30 questions, then they'll just drop off, right?
Yeah,
So just
sure.
make it like short and sweet, right? So we implemented that, and the response from that was fairly decent. I mean, like, let's just consider that this initiative was only run for like 4 or 5 weeks, if I'm not mistaken. So we got a total of sign up of 225 participants out of 400, of which 181 leads were generated, and out of which 15 of those were identified as on the client's wish list of the big fish that they were trying to go after.
Yeah, I've really liked the, gamification in the form of like content, meaning like
Yes.
that is the thing. We're not just going to talk about how important we are, and we're not going to get on our, you know, university professor lecture style delivery.
Yeah.
So I like that strategy. I always like, and I think, as a consumer of information too, like when anyone tries to challenge me, like, well, how good are you? How, can you pass this? It's fun.
Yeah.
It's a psychological thing where you're challenging someone, and that's the inherent tension that you're creating with that content is, ooh, there's a challenge that's been thrown down. Can I pass it?
Absolutely. And going back to your point, what we made sure we didn't do in this quiz was like go on about the client's products.
Yeah.
We focused on this trending topic, which, yes, the client's company was involved in that, but they're not the only one. So it's a little bit more top level, right? Because I mean, people, engineers are pretty smart. They can sniff out a veiled sales pitch, right? So we tried to make sure that it wasn't about the client's company at all. It was about them.
Yeah. So you've got like these 15 clients, potential customers, right? What do you do next that you've got this great list? How do you follow up and ultimately try to engage them or sell them something?
Well, I mean, that part of the process was, like we saw in the back end, like, compared their details to the client's database and said, hey, this might be somebody who's a right fit for what you guys sell. And then that went to the client salespeople to follow up, right?
Okay.
So, yeah.
All right. Makes sense. Yeah. Anything else about the case that you want to share?
It was, I think, one of these examples of company that was very predictably technical. They had very specialized like products and services. And this was a great example of a client that was willing that had a little bit of an appetite for risk, if I may say so, right? Because there's always a risk in putting things out there, right? But I think it was a calculated risk because it was a very small campaign. It was a short campaign to test out, to get a finger on the pulse of the market, to test things out. And it was great that the client was willing to go with us on that journey and take that risk. And it ended up actually being not just a fun, but an engaging exercise, not just for the client, but for their potential customers, right? Because one of the things, and I forgot to mention this earlier, that we noticed, from the data that was coming back, was the reason why the participation rate was so high was that people that we sent this online quiz to via DM or EDM then shared it with other engineers. Because going back to your point, they were like, hey, Jim, hey, Bob. So I got like 4 out of 6. Let's see how you do. Right.
Yeah.
So we tended to get a lot of like information or data that described that kind of situation.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah. All right. We're going to jump into case study number 3. This one.
Yeah.
For anyone who's worked at a large company, you realize the power and the need for internal comms. So many times we just figure these things out amongst us marketers, and there's 2 or 3 or 4 of us in a room, and we go, oh yeah, we've solved this problem, but we don't factor in the need to really communicate it, get people on board, make sure that they're aligned. So that's what you're going to focus on for this next one as it relates to an adhesives company.
Yeah. So I think I can start off this case study by saying this is where I really saw the adage out of sight, out of mind play out. Right? Because when we started working with this client, they're a global adhesives company, and we were working with their internal communications team that was responsible for 10 countries, 10 to 12 countries. Okay. So in the Asia Pacific region. And there were many problems that they were confronted with, but I think if I'm going to try to summarize it, like just for the sake of, in the interest of time, a lot of what they were doing was quite reactive in the beginning, right? They were seeing very low readership rates in what they called their intranets, their internal platform, where they posted content. They had a quarterly newsletter that was both available in print and on digital versions, and they were struggling to populate these newsletters with content. The fourth one, which we also thought was, it was an interesting challenge, but many of their non-communications colleagues in the other departments and business functions did not actually know what they were doing. Right?
Yeah.
The question would always come up. It wasn't surprising, but it was still interesting to observe. Like, we would come across people that were like, "Oh, okay, well, what is it exactly that your function does?" Right? So how do we solve that problem? Because there were that's a steep mountain to climb, right? But how we solved that problem was really we conducted an audit of the current assets, because we got to understand what we're dealing with here and what's currently being done, and focusing on the positive. So what is it that they're good at and they're doing well, what's doing well, and where's the room for improvement? Right?
Yep.
And after that, we then went on to conduct interviews with non-communications people. So in the different functions across the board. You name it, HR, finance, R&D, sales, etc., etc. And we asked them questions like, okay, do you log on to the internet? Do you read the newsletter? Why or why not? What is it you find interesting and why? What content would you like to see? So we tried to get insights from the potential reader's perspective, and to no surprise, the answers that they came up with were different from the answers that the communications team came up with. So we gathered all those insights and we conducted a workshop with the communications team. So everybody flew in from the different regions, and including one representative from the global HQ. And we said, okay, so this is the research that we did. This is what people like, and this is what needs to improve, and this is the reason why. So it's nothing personal. It's like, look, you guys want to improve? This is how you improve, right? And within that one full day, we hammered out an entire communication strategy for the entire year, complete with a content plan for the newsletter and for the intranet, right?
Yeah.
So strategy, and then we came up with the action plan, because like a strategy is only going to be as good as its implementation, right? Checklists of what to look for when you're searching for content. Every month had a different theme. The reason why they were running out of things to write is because there was no strategy. There was no theme to think of, right?
Right.
And when they did gather this information from people, they weren't asking the right questions. So we helped them to formulate, okay, what are the questions you need to be asking, right? And we launched the new approach and implemented all these initiatives based on the new strategy in spurts. And what I mean by that is like launch, monitor, test, iterate, repeat.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
And we saw over a period of, I'm going to say from 6 to 12 months, we ended up seeing eventually like a between 40 to 50% increase in readership in the intranet. We got to a point with the newsletter where there was too much content. we had to park it. We had to park some of the content, move it to the next quarter, right? People started becoming more cognizant, I'm going to say, or aware of the communications department. They were contacting the communications department with stories to contribute, right? Or when they had a call for interviewees, people signed up and said, I want to be interviewed by you now. Right?
Yeah.
Whereas previously that wasn't the case at all. So these were improvements that did not happen overnight. I'm going to be honest. But they were incremental. But I think within the span of like 2 to 3 years, we did see some visible improvements there.
Yeah, it's such a beast to
Yes.
align companies, especially when you're dealing with multiple countries where sometimes there's language and culture differences.
Absolutely.
But you realize when you put the time into internal comms, and in this case, an intranet to kind of be the hub, you start to see how eventually everyone starts talking about it and how it just becomes the new normal. And
Yes.
but it's never fast. I've never seen one of these projects happen in fewer than a year and a half. And that, like you said, I've seen it the same way, where you just got to get enough momentum. And then once you've hit that like tipping point, then you're like, all right, now everyone understands it. Now we can get better and we can fine tune it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. If I can just jump in, there was one other thing that we observed, which was really interesting. When we first engaged with this client, we saw that not all of their content, but majority of their content revolved around, interview with the CEO, interview with the regional MD, interview with all these people that were like upper levels of the organization, right? And the reason why the readership was low is because people could just not like associate with this person. It was too high up, right? But when we started changing that angle, where we're not saying like don't interview the CEO at all. Of course, every quarter there should be something like in the newsletter there should be a message from the CEO, right? But the interviews within the newsletter itself, within the intranet, right? Like for example, they had a theme about like simplification, which I think is great because they had a talent to overcomplicate everything, right? So simplify was such a great theme. So we would interview this mid-level manager from the engineering department, this intern that was starting out in HR. So it was people from different stages or different levels in different business units within the organization that were being interviewed. And that tended to resonate better with people. Why?
Yeah.
Because I know Sally from HR. Yeah, she just started last week,
yeah.
et cetera, right? So it goes down to like how you make the content relevant to the organization, relevant to the reader, but also highly relatable.
I agree. I think I've seen companies over-index on executive leadership, and yes, they need to have a presence in all these things, but almost
Absolutely.
It's dangerous to just rely on that. I remember one of the companies I was working for started hitting up everyone with more of a video strategy because the emails that the executives were sending out were just so boring. Like it just was like you would see these long emails come out, and in 3 to 5 seconds you would go, "Yep, I'm not interested in this," and there's really nothing new going on. And part of the way to get around that was just doing video, so that you had to actually watch the person speak, and you had more of a real connection listening and watching a video as opposed to just an email that just seemed overproduced. It was kind of like the PR team was there, the internal comms team was there. But video just has a really powerful way just to kind of feel like you're connecting to humans one to one.
Absolutely. Another little anecdote I'd like to throw in here was something that I can't claim credit for. This is something my ex-colleague said, who used to be a journalist. And he said, you got to look at it with a journalist's eye or look at it from a journalist's angle. And what that basically means is there's more than one way to tell a story. In fact, one of the workshops that we did with the communications team was we said, okay, so this is the exercise. This is the topic. Come up with 7 to 8 different story angles, right?
Yeah.
Because you can't just go at it from one angle, right? And why we got them to do this exercise is because we, when we started working with them, we would see content like, okay, the global team visited the facility and they toured the lab. So how can we make that more interesting or make somebody that doesn't care about that, like how can we pique their interest? Oh, the R&D team, we don't have to mention the name of the product, but they came up with a solution. And this is the adhesive that goes into your mobile device, right? And this is how long it takes them to make it. And this is what it consists of, et cetera, et cetera. And we come up with infographics and video, for example, right? So you're taking this, what would have otherwise been this very dry and boring topic of like, okay, the global team visited the lab as they would in like 30 other countries. But what made this particular visit so interesting?
Yeah.
Right.
Good point. All right. Thanks for sharing case study number 3. We're going to jump into Q&A. So Christian, tell us about your first gig in marketing. What were you doing?
Yeah. So, I mean, specifically with B2B marketing, that career for me officially started in 2011, right? So I was based out in Shanghai, China at the time, and I was working in an advertising agency that positioned itself as one that does unconventional advertising. What that basically means is guerrilla marketing and all those kinds of stunts, creative DMs. And I was senior account director at the time and also responsible for a new business. And I had just secured us a meeting where we were going to pitch for the Diageo Bailey's business. All right. So we went through the motions, came up with these great ideas, even produced some of the items that we were, proposing for the gift pack and et cetera, et cetera. And we worked tirelessly on that for 4 or 5 weeks, including weekends. And we finally presented it to the client, and the client loved the presentation. 2 weeks later, we got the phone call that we did not get the business. We were not awarded the business. As you can imagine, that was extremely demoralizing for the team who had worked day and night, burning the midnight oil, as they say. And that kind of fell back on me because I was the one that, that was my contact, and I reached out to them, and, that whole process. And what happened after that was, I think 2 or 3 days later, I had gone to a networking event, and this is where the story gets interesting. So I'm at the bar waiting for my drink, and I chat with this American gentleman. We exchange name cards, and he says, "Oh, you guys doing advertising? Okay, well, this is my company, and I'm not going to say who they are, Heavy Machinery. We need a corporate video. Can you come in and chat with us?" I'm like, "Sure." And that went on to become my very first B2B marketing project. And because if I can say so myself, we over-delivered on that project, and that client continued to give us business, and he became my long-term client for 8 or 9 years until he retired.
That's great. I'm going to go back to the pitch meeting that you talked about.
Sure.
I've done a lot of pitches, some that, they're long windows of pitching, right? So it's a 2-month, 3-month, 4-month thing.
Yep.
And you become you become obsessed, right? And you are so passionate about your ideas, and yes, you're aware that you're competing against other agencies.
Yeah.
But it always is so interesting when you find out whether you won or lost. And if you do lose, it's almost like you can't believe it, right? It's always, I don't understand what happened. And there's always, I shouldn't say always, there's usually very relevant feedback that you're given.
Absolutely.
And sometimes it has nothing to do with the idea or the energy that went into the production of that meeting. It's something totally different. It's about skill sets, or this was a safer decision. So, but the moment that you find out if you win or lose is always an exciting yet stressful day.
I'm going to be brutally honest, Steve, because I know why we lost that pitch.
Yeah, why?
And I can talk about it now in hindsight because it happened. It happened a while back. But we were essentially, as an agency, functioning within the silo, and in that silo, we all believed that our ideas were so hot that the client has to love it. And the mistake that we made there was not getting external feedback or validation, right?
Yes.
I should have shared this with my friends who were working at other agencies who were creative directors and say, "Hey, Brad, can you have a quick look at this key visual? Give me your thoughts on it." And they should have ripped the work apart, because that would have helped us to improve.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that's why we lost, right? Because we did not approach this with deep humility and get that feedback that we needed before the actual client presentation.
Yeah, that's a powerful insight. And I think that I can relate to that. The early part of my career, I was always so excited about an idea that I had come up with, or the team I was working on had come up with, that you just fight for the idea. And you realize now, after you've done it for a while, that's a very bad thing. You should not fight for the idea. Because one, you're just blindly going into it thinking that it's great, and it is not necessarily great. So when I kind of try to mentor younger folks in the industry, I kind of say, you're not pitching the idea, you're sharing an idea. And you have to look at it almost like the idea is on the wall, and you and the other person are standing side by side looking at the idea. So you're not representing the idea. I'm not trying to win you over.
Right.
It's just, hey, there's an idea on the wall. Let's talk about what's working, what's not working.
Yep.
I wish I had that advice early on in my career, because that's where you get better feedback. And some ideas just need to be scrapped. They're not good.
Yep.
But many times someone can give feedback and take an idea and make it better. And that's where you realize that's really the power of sharing ideas as opposed to pitching them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And another thing I can say, just to add on to that, which I learned fairly quickly, but I wish especially some of the members of the creative team, I should have adopted this skill much earlier on in the piece. Do not take the feedback personally. It's got nothing to do with you.
Yeah.
Right. And I find that we would have avoided so many unpleasant conversations or confrontations if people would have just taken the feedback as, listen, this is why it doesn't work, and this is why, and this is what you can do about it. And how often have you and I been in brainstorming sessions, or first internal review where the creative guy gets up and tears tears everything up and says, you guys don't appreciate my work. It's not about that at all. It's about, how does this help our client, who is ultimately, if we get this business, going to pay us, right? How does it help them?
Yeah. It's challenging. Creative people are wired very differently.
Oh,
A
yes.
good way, like intentionally, you want them wired differently because they
Yes.
don't always approach things conventionally, but you do have to bring them into the world of reality, whether that's
Yeah.
hey, the client's running a business. Hey, this idea is a little too risky.
Yep.
My pet peeve when I worked a longer time ago on the agency / advertising world was I cannot see another idea that needs a celebrity spokesperson to pull it off. I'm like, the clients,
Yep.
very few clients have that money or that appetite for a big celebrity name. And my advice to the teams was always, if the idea works without a celebrity, then it's still an idea. But you can't just bank on the celebrity to pull everything off.
100%. 100%.
What do you enjoy most about marketing? You and I have been doing it for a while. What gets you excited?
Yeah, believe it or not, I love solving problems. And I think a big part of marketing is the ability to solve a client's problem. I think it's not the only reason why this profession or this discipline exists, but it is one of the primary reasons, I believe. So it's the ability to solve problems, the ability to address these inherent challenges that their business is facing with their customers, potentially also within the organization. Back to the internal communications piece. Okay? So that's what gets me excited about marketing. And, with every case, it's different, right? Like, even if you can say like, oh, it's a communications issue, but it's going to be a different level of that it's a different type of problem with each case, right? Because it depends on the stage that the company is in, the level of maturity, the type of team that they have, the different dynamics, and so on, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you on the problem solving. I'm super passionate in trying to figure out the problem, and I'm always surprised how many people
Yes.
that I work with when we talk marketing, right? So we're in the trenches, we are knee deep in marketing and comms conversations, and then you ask, well, what's the business problem we're trying to solve here? And they just don't have an answer. And that's a good place to be, meaning you've now uncovered something that really will help refine your marketing program. Because if you cannot say this is the business problem and this is how we're going to solve it, it really is just it's a conversation that anyone can win. It's just who's the most important person in the room is going to determine what we're doing, as opposed to what's the best plan to solve that problem.
Absolutely.
What gets you frustrated with marketing? What is something that you're like, oh man, if I could get rid of this one thing, I'd be so much more happy?
Yeah, you know what, Steve, I've been thinking about this one for a while, right? Because there's so many ways I could go with this. But people that come and ask you for your advice or your recommendations, you give it to them and they say, okay, you know what? I'm going to go and do the complete opposite of what you just told me to do. Right? And then they come back and complain that it didn't work.
Yeah.
That drives me absolutely nuts. All right.
Yeah.
The second one, which I've seen both on the client side and internally on the agency side, is this constant. You've probably heard of these diseases because they're not rare, right? They're very common, actually. The first disease is analysis paralysis, and the second disease is opinionitis.
Appendicitis. Nice. I've heard of the first disease, not the second disease. I've learned something new today.
I've been in situations before, and again, I'm not naming names, but where there was a website revamp or there was a rebrand, and it went through it was supposed to be a 3-month exercise and then became an 18-month exercise, then a 24-month exercise, because people could just not agree they just were not aligned on where this is all going. And with every new design, every new positioning that we came up with, every iteration, there was just something new that had to be thrown into the pot. And those kinds of situations drive me up the wall because it's a road to nowhere.
Yeah. I've always been a big fan of, I call those like tiebreaker moments. And my recommendation that I've tried to make policy is just no worries if we have a tiebreaker. Customer gets to decide.
Yes.
And there's nothing that I've seen be more productive where the customer is making those decisions, whether it's a focus group or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And quickly you will see the person who is representing idea one or idea two, like they just have to rally around what the customer is saying. Like you can't
Right.
dismiss the customer as, well, they don't know what they're talking about or they're not smart. It's like they're the customer and they have more of skin in the game than we do in our own work.
Absolutely.
All right, last question for you. I sound like I'm positioning us as two old people, but we are. We're veteran marketers. We're not old. Veteran.
It's all right. Ask away.
What's the what you alluded to this in one of the conversations already about, looking back, like we were too passionate about the idea. We didn't share it to get feedback. What are some other things that you've learned over your career that you could pass along to someone kind of just starting out in marketing to say, yeah, this was a mistake I used to make, but I don't make it anymore?
Yeah. Again, this is another one of these questions that I reflected on because there are so many things, there's so many ways I could go with this. But if I were to summarize it, it would be as follows. Number one, stop being a people pleaser, right? It gets you nowhere fast and it opens the door to people taking advantage of you. And that happened very early on in my career. And I ended up doing the job of 3 or 4 other people because I thought it was actually teamwork, right? But what they were doing was they were just farming off their work to me, right?
Yes.
And for those of you starting out in your career, please be wary and cognizant of people like that, right? So that would be the first thing. Learning how to say no and pushing back on things that are not within your own interest or within the interest of your company and the interest of your clients is perhaps one of the most powerful things that you can do professionally, in my opinion, right? Learning how to say no. It took me years, Steve, to master that one because I always felt, I don't know if you can relate to this, but I always felt guilty when I would turn something down, when I would say no, whether it was internally or whether it was from a client, right? I would always be like, yeah, okay, sure. And at the end of the, 6 p.m. rolled around and I've got like 15 unfinished tasks, right? And because I didn't know how to prioritize, I didn't know how to manage my time at that point. It's because I just did not know how to say no, right?
Yeah.
So there's that. Don't be influenced too much by the opinions of others. I think there's another one. That was something also, again, kind of interconnected with the saying no part. It's something that I always took to heart, and which is why I mentioned earlier on in the conversation, do not take this feedback personally, even if sometimes it might be. You have to learn, and this is something an ex-boss of mine told me, when you're in this business, you just gotta grow a thicker skin. You gotta be like an ankylosaurus or a pangolin. You just gotta grow that armor, man.
Yeah.
And when somebody shoots an arrow at you, it'll just go, right?
Yeah. Yeah, great advice. You are almost ready to retire. You've passed along many learnings over the course of your career. We're going to turn the podcast into your retirement party for sharing so much wisdom with us today.
Thank you, but not anytime soon.
Yeah. All right, Christian, I enjoyed getting to know you more. I know our listeners did as well. So thank you for being on the podcast. And everyone else, thank you for tuning in to listen again to another episode of Interesting B2B Marketers. We'll see you again here at Studio 26. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks for tuning in to the Interesting B2B Marketers podcast. Be sure to subscribe wherever you heard this podcast so you never miss an episode. If you found value in today's episode, please help grow the podcast by sharing with others and leaving a review. We'll see you next time.